Thank you. After those two models of clarity, I'm now going to try and say the same things but less clearly, but also more crudely, because I've also been given the task to think about why do we look at Marx, who didn't, as Brendan was saying, didn't live to see the beginning of the science of climate change, I'm going to return to this argument that he analyses with unusual clarity, what he called the capitalist mode of production. So we'll cover this kind of ground again and think through it in a couple of different ways. Hopefully it'll be complementary to what Brendan was saying. And secondly, and I guess this is linked to what Alice was saying, he did so already within the context of an emerging revolutionary movement against capitalism. And of course, people have argued constantly about what Marxism is really about. It's been the subject of boring academic debates, sectarian squabbles, police denunciations, crude anti-communist propaganda. But I think for most of us, the most important thing is that it is part of a shared tradition of struggle that has involved millions of people around the world. And it's millions of people who have made links between anti-colonial struggle, struggles against militarism, sexism, and environmental destruction, and they've linked that to their understanding of the capitalist system. And people have come to this in different ways, but that is a shared tradition. It's not just what the ideas that were so clearly exposed and developed by a German migrant a few meters down the road. It's also all of those millions of people around the world who have created this kind of body of action as well as thought. So yesterday on the RS21 website, we published a paper by Brian Parkin, who sends his greetings to this conference, by the way. And he explores a paradox that we've already been talking about today, which is the climate science is unequivocal. So we've heard about the IPCC report, the Austere, that said we're 12 years to keep global warming below a minimum of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and failure to do so, the impact of failure to do so on millions of people. And yet, which has a very simple implication, basic implication, which is that existing fossil fuel reserves need to be kept in the ground. And yet we keep on seeing this rise. And Brian looks at two reports written to advise investment bankers, the classic socialist reading that we should all be doing, saying what a bad investment, continued investment in fossil fuels is. So, because of the stranded assets, that they are, the prices of renewables are tumbling, and so people are throwing money after, in the wrong place by doing so. But yet, despite the fact that even within these kinds of these kinds of reports, these arguments are being made, world consumption of fossil fuels continues to rise, and this is what we've been talking about all the time. So the International Energy Agency forecasts saying that irrespective of the state of the world economy, over the last few years demand has increased annually at a rate of approximately 90 million barrels per day. So my job then is to slightly schematically go through some of the ways in which the logic of capitalism has kind of created this perverse set of affairs. And the first is to once again kind of recap in quite general terms the general logic of the capitalist mode of production. But then I then want to do three more things, which is to think through the logic of what Andreas Malm calls fossil capital, and then I want to think through, a third is to think through the logic, and this is the subject of Brian's paper, think about the logic of periods and the kind of and then the fourth is to think about what the kind of current neoliberal period that we're living in is, with what the Naomi Klein describes as the kind of ultimate case of bad timing, that we live in the crunch years, or we've come to the crunch years in the context of neoliberalism. So just the general logic. Karl Marx was well aware that the emerging capitalist societies of his own time were not the only ones to have experienced economic growth. But one of the things he argued was distinctive about it was the way in which the system compels continuous growth. He argued that it's a system of human-made institutional arrangements which governing ever greater aspects of existence on Earth. Capitalism removes alternative ways for people to produce for themselves and for their communities, and forces workers to sell their labour power for specific times for return for money. At the same time, it forces capitalists to return a profit on the goods they've produced by uniting workers with the tools required to make them. This is all this familiar arguments. And so that if a capitalist fails to make profit, they go out of business, but locked into competition with other capitalists to make a profit, the capitalist must forever do two things, which is to either, in some combination, increase the material throughput or ratchet up the exploitation of labour. And because of class struggle, it's impossible to continuously ratchet up the exploitation of labour. So there's a continuous drive to ratchet up the material throughput. Now, the second thing I want to then come to is then the logic of fossil capital. Through the violence of its colonial empire, which we've been talking about, the British ruling class helped to ensure the domination of this set of institutional arrangements across the planet. But it has a further dubious honour, which is that it tied that same logic of continuous growth to a cycle of expanding fossil fuel consumption. And here, I think the work of Andreas Malm is really extremely useful, because there's a conventional story of the Industrial Revolution, which is that a combination of a kind of geological accident, which was relatively accessible coal, and British ingenuity, the harnessing of steam power to industrial production, enabled Britain to outcompete the rest of the world and escape the limits imposed by population size and available land. And an influential version of this kind of argument has been used to explain what's called the Great Divergence between Britain and China, which was much more economically advanced in many ways at the end of the 18th century than Britain. What's really useful about what Andreas Malm's work shows is that manufacturers in 19th century England turned to steam power over traditional sources of power, such as water mills. Sources which in fact use kind of circular logic or cyclical logic. They turn to this kind of linear method, to use the terminology we're now learning, not because it offered cheaper or more abundant energy, but instead because it made it easier to control workers. It made it easier to control the time and the space in which work is carried out. You can control the working day, and you control where people live and where they do the work. And so it's also a product of class struggle, the fact that technology was used. It would be possible to access the same, in a way, cheaper or equally cheap, the same kind of effect, but it was precisely because of because using water power on the scale required would require a greater degree of coordination between the capitalists than they were prepared to accept, or that their kind of competitive logic allowed them to accept. And it would also put them at the mercy of the relationship between human beings and nature, and where people live in order to do the work. And so it gave them that extra bit of control. Okay, so that's Andreas Malm's really useful kind of argument about fossil capital, and the way in which then through its kind of preeminent kind of position, its military power, then the British state then kind of ties the rest of the world economy into this logic. Once enough capitalists have done it, and once the British state has backed up, in a way it kind of closes down the options for exploiting that potential other cheap sources of power. The third is the logic of imperialism. By the early 20th century, it was becoming apparent that the logic of capitalism was not only shaping the relationship between individual capitalists, but between entire states. And the horror of the First World War caused many socialists to line up behind their respective governments, but some argued, tried to kind of critique, to understand what was happening, and developed an analysis of what they called imperialism. And in his 1915 study, Imperialism World Economy, the Russian revolutionary Nikolai Bukharin analysed a key contradiction that was driving that conflict. He noticed that as capital's circuits of production exchange became increasingly international, at the same time there was a process through which capital became increasingly tied up with individual nation states and their military power. And this drives military competition between states, and in turn reshapes the real organisation not only of the order, all of the states and the organisation of the world economy, but also reshapes the internal logic of those states. So they become shaped by that. And this is, again with my kind of editor of the R21 website hat on, I would recommend that comrades read the serialized article by Colin Barker that we published, looking at this precise contradiction, the existence of multiple states, and how these logics play out between states and within them. 5 minutes left, that's fine. I will try not to speak too fast though, in that I won't just speed up with kind of capitalist logic of speeding up and faster. The UK's, and to a greater extent the US's fossil fuel corporations have consistently worked then to reshape the international state system and the internal structure of the British and US states. So this is both those elements are crucial. So the strategic resources of the Middle East aren't just a product of geological accident, but of class struggle and interstate wars fought to ensure a specific configuration both of the world economy, but also of individual states. Until 1973, 7 US and UK corporations known as the Seven Sisters, so Chevron, Gulf, Mobil, Texaco, BP and Shell, controlled over 85% of the world's petroleum reserves. Now, in 1973, this shifted, and there was a little bit of discussion on this in the previous session, the way in which the kind of control shifted somewhat towards OPEC cartel of oil-producing countries. But by this point, the strategic interests of the US state have become thoroughly tied up with its control of the world's primary energy hub. So what these companies had done, they had not only kind of forced the power and the economic power and the military power of the US to be used to control these areas and to wage war on the populations who didn't think they should have their oil stolen. But it also reshaped the entire structure of the US state in order to make that the interest of the US state. So that's the third point, the logic of imperialism, where it reshapes the way in which this kind of nexus between petrol and the state system and the world economy kind of reshape each other. And so, we're living in a period where US dominance is unraveling, but the connection between imperial competition and the dependence of the world economy on oil kind of remains unbroken. It's kind of been, in many ways, kind of locked in by these dynamics. And then the fourth is the logic of neoliberalism. And so, in some ways, it might seem that what I was describing, this kind of contradiction between tendencies of capital's circuits of production exchange to become increasingly international and simultaneously become more nationalised. We might have thought that this kind of ends with the neoliberal era. Kind of the last 30 or 40 years is often seen as a period in which the state has been under attack. The privatisation of formerly nationalised industries, collapse of bureaucratic state regimes of the Soviet bloc. But a more accurate way of seeing this period is one in which state and corporate managers have colluded to shift the function, shift the function of the state in the interests of the owners of capital. So the repressive and military side of states has continued to grow, while at the same time state managers and the owners of capital have attempted to shift the burden of providing for the needs of all of us, healthcare, social care and education, and social reproduction of the system as a whole, onto us, onto working class people. And all along this process, the violent use of state power has been used to achieve that effect, what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine, been used again and again to reorganise economies in ways that people don't want. It's precisely the kind of absence of democracy that Alice been talking about, in such a way that only market solutions are then permissible. And then this, of course, then leaves us, only allowing market solutions to be permissible to solve the fundamental crises to which they're completely unsuited, and above all, of course, this is the climate change. And so it's in this sense that Naomi Klein is right, I think, to talk about this as a crisis of bad timing. But there's a flip side to all of this, which I'm going to get to in 1 minute, and then we will talk about together, which is the point, is to break out of this spiral. It's all very well to understand kind of the way these logics existed, but Marxism is a theory just about how we're all doomed. It's a political tradition that rests on the wager that through the collective democratic action of working class people, through the kind of expansion of kind of democracy that Alice is talking about, a different world can be built. And currently, as we were talking about in the last session, in some ways it feels traditional organisations of working class power feel very weak at the moment. But we are also seeing insurgent movements breaking out across the world, from Hong Kong to Catalonia, Lebanon, Chile, and Iraq. There's a little passage in Greta Thunberg's book that Jonathan Neal kind of pointed out, where she talks about how she was inspired to invent the school climate strike by the strikers at Parkland's High School in Florida after the shooting there. And Jonathan points out that strike was in turn influenced by the women's marches, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter school walkouts. It's important to understand the way that different struggles inspire each other, and the way in which the climate strikes will change those struggles to make each other stronger and wider. So understanding the logic of capitalism and how it came into being is important, but as Ursula Grün put it, we live in capitalism, its power is inescapable, but so do the divine right of kings. And our task is to see the links between the struggle for climate justice, the different struggles for liberation, and the struggle to put an end to the capitalist exploitation of humans and nature. And so that's what obviously we're all trying to do. So thanks.